When parents come to a sibling seminar in person, I always start out by asking them to talk a little bit about what their sibling relationships had been. And I ask, well, did you have a good relationship with your children? And most people will say they had a good enough relationship. There are those occasional who say they were terrible and some that will say they were wonderful, but most say they were pretty good. And then I ask them, how's your relationship now? And almost always parents will reply, they're pretty good, we get along. The point is that your relationship that you had with a sibling growing up doesn't necessarily predict the relationship that you're going to have with your sibling when you grow up as an adult. So we're going to talk about siblings today, about all the different aspects of sibling relationships and how you can encourage positive sibling relationships, keeping in mind that all parents want to have positive relationships with their kids and knowing that that is our goal in the end, because no one really comes to me and says, I don't care how my kids relate. We all know that we want our kids to get along when they're adults, and many parents will say to me, we're going to die one day and all our kids are going to have will be themselves and their relationship, which is kind of a morbid thing to think about. But then again, in the end, our kids will have one another as siblings. In fact, the sibling relationship is the very longest relationship your children will ever have. My siblings, remember I have triplets, they've already known one another longer than I've known them, and they'll continue to know one another and hopefully be close long after we're gone. So the truth be told, the positive aspects to sibling relationships are really the ones that parents think about. They mainly emphasize the negative ones. I don't really emphasize them. Children mainly hear their parents discussing the negative aspects of sibling relationships. Why don't you two get along? Or I can't stand all your fighting, or you're always competing, or they hear their parents discussing their relationship. The truth of the matter is, all sibling relationships have ups and downs. Even the parents who say their kids really get along well and they don't ever fight, they're not right, because all kids fight every once in a while or more. And all kids get along every once in a while. So if we have a fantasy that we're going to have children who get along beautifully, who love each other kindly, who speak to one another with respect, who never fight, who never hurt, who never tattle, it's not going to happen. So let's get that idea out of your head to begin with. But children don't get to grow up around parents who talk about how wonderful sibling relationships can be. They don't talk about their own sibling relationships with their own siblings currently. They mainly hear about the bad stuff. So let's begin with setting a tone for wanting our kids to hear that sibling relationships really can be great, and there's a lot that we can do to encourage that. The sibling relationship, I think, is the most unique relationship of all those that a family can have, because it exists in the choppy waters of love and hate. Siblings often hate each other one minute and love each other the next minute. Your sibling is the only person you can truly treat horribly, and he's not going to go away. He's still going to be there. Your sibling is a person you can do terrible things to, call him names, hide from him, take his stuff, hit him, do terrible things. He's still going to be your sibling. There's nothing you can do about it. That relationship will persist. At the same time, the very person who you may not adore is the same person you're going to defend till the end on the play yard. You will take good care of, you'll watch out for, and go home and hate him. You can have a great time together and the next minute be biting one another's heads off. It's such a funny relationship. There's lots to be learned from a sibling relationship. That's the good news. There are many lessons about compromise, about giving, about taking, about giving in, about sharing, about taking turns. Children who have siblings seem to learn to get along with other people earlier than children who don't. And they develop the skills for getting along or not earlier than others. You'll often hear a nursery school teacher say that a class full of siblings is a whole different class than a class full of firstborns. It's no wonder that sibling children know how to grab and know how to take and know how to stick up for themselves much earlier often than firstborn children. So here we have a relationship that's like none other a child will ever experience. Sibling relationships give siblings an opportunity to practice all their relationships. Not only do they get to practice the getting along stuff, and do they cultivate the coping mechanisms, the social skills to get along, but I think having a sibling also sensitizes you to other people very early on. Maybe doesn't make you a sensitive person, but it sensitizes you to the way other people are. And in addition to that, it jump-starts your lessons in empathy, because a sibling learns early on that he has to get into the shoes of somebody else to understand how he affects that other person. It happens very early when siblings live with one another, as early as 2 years old for one and younger for another. There have been lots of studies about siblings, as you might imagine. One study in particular showed that siblings who are both girls tend to have the closest bonds when they're growing up, and boys not as close, but that's only when they're growing up. Another study was done of siblings ages 19 to 71, and in that study, it showed all kinds of interesting things. Siblings who described themselves as having been close also described their families as being close. And to me, that means that warm feelings carry over. When there's warmth in a family, there's going to be warmth between siblings, or among siblings if there are more. Another study showed that sibling closeness seems to leapfrog. In other words, in families where there are more than 2 children, child number 1 and child number 3 will be closer than number 2 and number 3. When there are more than 3, when there's 4 children, pretty typically 1 and 3 will be as close, and 2 and 4 will be close. The only time that doesn't work out that way is when there's a large age discrepancy among 2 sets, in which case parents tend to group them, the big ones and the little ones. And of course, when there tend to be multiples in a family, that's also affected, because we group the kids in a certain way, and their closeness tends to develop as a result of that. It's interesting to note that there doesn't seem to be any perfect age span for kids. Whether they're closer or farther apart in age does not determine how close they are in the end. When children are closer in age, however, we do know that the closer they are in age, the more likely they are to fight, and the closer they will be in the end. And there's no perfect age to space your child, to space your children. In other words, people will ask me, what's the best space to have between your children? The answer is, I have no idea. I can tell you that the closer the age they are, the harder it is going to be for you. And my best advice is to make sure that the first child can talk before the second one is born, because he needs to be able to say, send him back, when he's slowly going crazy. The most important thing that I can tell you about siblings and the age difference between them and their birth order is that none of those things is as important as each child's relationship with you. That's the single most important part of sibling relationships, and it is at the basis of how siblings relate to one another. If you're particularly sensitive to one child or another, meaning the firstborn or the secondborn or the middle or the oldest or the younger, it usually has to do with what your position was in your family growing up, because we tend to identify with the child who's going to have the same place that we have. But then again, there are no studies that show that a child, a firstborn, is better off than a secondborn or a thirdborn. I will tell you that I often call the first child your practice child, because we visit all of our mistakes on that child, kind of like a pancake that gets a little too brown. Oops, we just toss it, do much better job on the second batch. And then there's that thirdborn. I think that thirdborn child is like a self-basting turkey. He just kind of raises himself. But this is about sibling relationships, so we'll move on. While this seminar isn't really meant for new babies and introducing new babies into a family, nor is it really about how to get a firstborn to get along with a brand new baby, I do want to tip my hat to that for a minute and say this. When you bring a new child into the life of a firstborn. It's a little bit like a husband saying to a wife, you know, dear, I love you so much that I'm going to bring home another wife just like you. Won't it be great? That's pretty much how the sibling hears it. You love him so much that you're going to bring home another one of him. Yikes, that's not a good thing for your child. So, when you're about to introduce a new child into the family, be mindful of course, how it's going to affect the whole equilibrium of your family, keeping in mind that your child has been the crown prince for whether it's a year or 2 years or 4 years, and it can be tricky business. I suggest that you do a lot of preparation in advance, but not too far in advance, because children have a different idea about time. And so what you want to do is make sure that you're not telling them about this pregnancy the day after you got the test back, but maybe only when you begin showing and your child begins to wonder why mommy is looking fat. And at that point, you can certainly say that mommy is growing a baby and take it from there. By the way, that conversation you'll be able to hear about when I do my sex seminar. Moving back to introducing the new baby, however, it's always a good idea to take your child, if possible, to visit a newborn, because your child has this idea that you're growing a baby in your body who's going to come out and ride a tricycle with him. And we all know that's not the case. New babies bring a lot of noise and smells and toys and mess to the house. So if you can take your child in anticipation of your new baby's birth, to visit a home where there is a new baby, it will be tremendously helpful. The other things to keep in mind have to do with involving your firstborn in as much of the new baby setup as possible. Let that child be a part of playing in the new baby's room. This is before the baby comes, of course. Maybe sitting in the crib, maybe setting up the toys, maybe looking in the drawers, doing all those kinds of things in anticipation of the arrival. It's going to be tough when that new baby comes home, but it's not because the new baby is a problem. It's because what that new baby does to your relationship with the child. You've been there all in for that baby, and now suddenly there's a new one taking your spot. So be aware of how important it will be to not hold that baby all the time, to make sure that that firstborn is getting the attention that he needs, slowly introducing the sharing of that attention. And when presents come in the house, let the firstborn open the presents. It's hard to see a new baby get so many presents when none of them are for you. In addition to that, I honestly don't think it's going to be as problematic as you think it will be until that newborn starts to encroach on the firstborn's stuff. And that's somewhere in the 7 or 8 month time when that baby begins to crawl and encroaches on all of the space and the possessions of the newborn. That's tough. And my final bit of advice about this is to make sure that the newborn owns a bunch of things that did not belong to the firstborn. Some things your firstborn will remember. And remember, he already thinks that everything in the house belongs to him. So we want to make sure that that new baby has some of his own stuff. So let's jump into this. Let's talk about sibling rivalry right from the start, because after all, I think that's what you want to be hearing about. Sibling rivalry is natural and inevitable. There is nothing that you did to create it, and there's nothing that you did to make it bad or worse. There are lots of things that you can do, however, to make it not quite as intense as sibling rivalry can be. It's a funny thing, sibling rivalry. It appears to be about all of these different things, whether it's about possessions or toys or attention, but sibling rivalry is pretty dominantly about territory and dominance. But the truth be told, sibling rivalry is really about parental attention. It's not really about this stuff. Because what sibling rivalry is a triangle. It's about 3 pieces: parent, child, and child. And interestingly enough, when you take one of those elements away, the sibling rivalry changes. Take away one child, no sibling rivalry. Take away the other child, no rivalry. Take away the parent, a lot of the rivalry disappears. And that's why I'm telling you this. Because children believe that there's only a single space in your heart for them. In other words, you have only room for one child. They don't realize that the heart is an amazing muscle. One sibling will see that the child who gets the bulk of the parent's attention, and that attention can be negative or positive, is the one who is taking up the greatest amount of room in your heart. Sibling rivalry often appears to be about nothing. Kids can find the most amazing things to fight over. Who has the bent spoon? Who got the blue glass? Crazy stuff. But that's because it's not really about stuff. Because, as I said, sibling rivalry also depends on developmental stages of kids. Toddlers, 1.5-year-olds, absolutely can't stop themselves from getting into the stuff of the big kid. They get into all of their toys. They want to do whatever the big kid is doing. That's developmental. On top of that, that younger child always adores the older child. All he wants is to be with that child, to be with his stuff, to get his attention. Much like the annoying mosquito, the older child often can't stand it. He just wants to get that child away because he can be so annoying. The nature of sibling fights will change as children get older, because as they get older, the focus is not so much on the home and the family and the toys and the stuff. As children get older, their attention goes to different places, to siblings, to after-school activities, to sports, to arts, to other interests, and the focus of the world isn't so much on the home. It won't always be as tough as it feels right now.